Dennis Hawkins, 2010. In what could be described as the most flamboyant bank robbery attempt in Pittsburgh history, Dennis Hawkins decided to disguise himself in a way that would make him more noticeable, not less. His choice of disguise became a legendary example of criminal incompetence. Picture this: a 48-year-old man walks into a bank wearing a female blonde wig, fake breasts under a sweater, and clown pants. But that's not even the most ridiculous part. After robbing the bank of an undisclosed amount of money, Hawkins attempted to carjack a woman in a nearby parking lot. The dye pack and the stolen money exploded, covering him in bright red dye. Still wearing his outlandish disguise and now covered in red dye, Hawkins decided to stop at a nearby gas station. Witnesses described seeing a tall man in a blonde wig and clown pants covered in red dye attempting to act casual. Police found him sitting in the gas station, still in full costume. The most fascinating aspect of this case is how it demonstrates the psychological disconnect some criminals have from reality. Hawkins seemingly believed that such an outrageous disguise would somehow make him less conspicuous, when in fact it made him impossible to ignore. Albert Bailey. In what might be the most polite bank robbery attempt ever recorded, Albert Bailey demonstrated that customer service and crime don't mix. This case became a perfect example of how common sense completely abandons some criminals. Bailey actually called the bank ahead to ensure they would have $100,000 ready for him to steal. Like making a dinner reservation, he told them exactly when he would arrive for the robbery. The bank naturally contacted the police, who simply waited for their courteous criminal to arrive right on schedule. When Bailey showed up at his appointed time, he found himself surrounded by police officers rather than the helpful bank tellers he expected. The most remarkable aspect of this case is how Bailey seemed to believe that scheduling his crime would somehow make it more successful. This case demonstrates an almost childlike naivety about how the real world works, showing how some criminals can become so disconnected from reality that they forget even the most basic logic of their illegal activities.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more topics you love.
John OPPERMAN-GREEN. In what could be called the ultimate return customer scenario, John OPPERMAN-GREEN provided a masterclass in how not to commit a crime. His case serves as a perfect example of how panic can lead to astoundingly poor decisions. During a robbery attempt, OPPERMAN-GREEN accidentally dropped his ATM card at the crime scene. Not just any card, but his own personal ATM card with his full name and account details. It was as if he had left a signed confession at the scene. The most incredible part of this story is that he didn't even realize his mistake until the police showed up at his door. They didn't need any complex investigation or forensic analysis, just a simple piece of plastic with his name on it. This case beautifully illustrates how the stress of committing a crime can cause even the most basic aspects of self-preservation to completely malfunction. It's a reminder that under pressure, our brains don't always work in our best interest. Ruben Zarate. In what could only be described as a masterclass in poor target selection, Ruben Zarate attempted what might be the most ill-conceived robbery in criminal history, trying to rob a gun store filled with armed professionals and customers. walking into Suburban Sporting Goods, a store specifically designed to sell weapons and staffed by people trained to use them. Zarate announced his robbery attempt. The store's employees and customers, all well versed in firearm use, responded exactly as one might expect. Within seconds, Zarate found himself facing multiple drawn weapons from various angles. It was like bringing a knife to a gunfight, except he didn't even have a knife. The situation would have been comical if it hadn't been so dangerous. This case perfectly illustrates how desperation can override even the most basic survival instincts. It's a prime example of how criminal thinking can become so focused on the goal that it completely ignores obvious dangers and common sense. Michael Harrell. In what might be the most helpful self-incrimination case ever recorded, Michael Harrell took the concept of leaving evidence behind to an entirely new level. His story serves as a testament to how criminal planning can go hilariously wrong. Harrell walked into a U.S. bank in Cleveland and handed the teller a note demanding money. However, he had written this demand note on the back of his own birth certificate. As if that wasn't enough, he also helpfully provided his full name and address on the document. The teller, who could hardly believe her eyes, noted that Harrell was even a regular customer at the bank. She actually knew him by name, making the birth certificate evidence almost unnecessary. The police didn't exactly need Sherlock Holmes levels of detective work for this case. This incident perfectly demonstrates how stress and panic can lead to absurdly obvious mistakes, even in the minds of people attempting to commit crimes. Christopher Koch. In what could be called the most brand-loyal robbery attempt ever, Christopher Koch decided to commit his crime while proudly displaying his workplace credentials. His case serves as a perfect example of how oversight can reach comically levels. Koch walked into a bank wearing his work uniform, complete with his name tag clearly visible. He didn't even bother to remove or cover the tag that displayed Christopher in clear view of all the security cameras and witnesses. What makes this case particularly fascinating is that Koch returned to work after the robbery, still wearing the same uniform. It was as if he believed that his criminal activity existed in a completely separate reality from his regular job. The case demonstrates how some criminals can become so focused on the mechanics of their crime that they completely overlook the most obvious details of their appearance and identification. James JEBBIA. In what could be described as the most relaxed burglary in criminal history, James JEBBIA transformed a standard break-in into an impromptu dining and napping experience. His case perfectly illustrates how comfort can lead to capture in the most ridiculous way possible. After breaking into a residential home, JEBBIA decided to make himself completely at home. He began by raiding the refrigerator, cooking himself a full meal from the homeowner's groceries. But that was just the beginning of his surprisingly domestic crime spree. After enjoying his unauthorized feast, he felt the natural urge that comes after a big meal drowsiness. Instead of completing his burglary and making a quick escape, JEBBIA made himself comfortable on the homeowner's couch. Perhaps it was the combination of a full stomach and a cozy sofa, or maybe it was just criminal overconfidence, but he drifted off into a deep sleep right there in his victim's living room. The homeowner returned to find JEBBIA peacefully sleeping on the couch, surrounded by the remains of his impromptu meal. The police arrived to find him still sleeping, making it possibly the easiest arrest in law enforcement history. They didn't need to chase him, tackle him, or even raise their voices. They simply had to wake him up. What makes this case particularly fascinating is the psychological aspect of JEBBIA's behavior. It demonstrates an almost surreal level of comfort with criminal activity, where the perpetrator feels so at home in someone else's house that they literally make themselves at home. The case serves as a perfect example of how some criminals become so disconnected from reality that they forget the basic premise of their crime, that they're not supposed to be there in the first place. It's as if the burglar temporarily forgot he was a burglar and behaved like a houseguest who had overstayed their welcome. Matthew McNELLY, Joey Miller. In what might be the most artistically challenged criminal attempt ever recorded, Matthew McNELLY and Joey Miller revolutionized the concept of disguise by taking it to new levels of absurdity. Their case serves as a masterpiece of criminal miscalculation and poor artistic choices. The duo decided to disguise themselves before attempting their crime, but instead of using masks, wigs, or any traditional disguise methods, they opted for a more creative approach. Using permanent marker, they drew masks directly onto their faces. Not sophisticated masks, mind you, but crude, childlike scribbles that looked like something from a preschooler's art project. The most fascinating aspect was their apparent belief that drawing on their faces with marker would somehow make them unrecognizable. They didn't just draw small masks around their eyes, they covered large portions of their faces with thick black marker lines, creating what looked like a bizarre cross between a Halloween costume and a toddler's drawing. The booking photos became instant classics in the annals of criminal stupidity. The permanent marker proved to be truly permanent, meaning they had to attend their court appearances still sporting traces of their disguises. What makes this case particularly interesting from a psychological perspective is the level of magical thinking involved. It's as if they believed that simply drawing on their faces would create some kind of invisibility effect, completely ignoring the fact that they were actually making themselves more conspicuous. The case also raises fascinating questions about decision-making under stress. At no point during the process of drawing on each other's faces did either of them step back and question the logic of their plan. It's a perfect example of how groupthink can override common sense, especially when criminal intent is involved. Kenneth AFFOLTER. In what could be called the most counterproductive quality control effort in criminal history, Kenneth AFFOLTER demonstrated an almost admirable commitment to customer satisfaction that ultimately led to his downfall. His case represents a unique intersection of entrepreneurial spirit and spectacular misjudgment. AFFOLTER was running an illegal operation producing marijuana-laced candy and snacks. However, what sets his case apart was his bizarre decision to ensure product quality through the most inappropriate means possible. In an apparent attempt to verify the quality of his illegal products, he actually sent samples directly to the police department for testing. His reasoning, if it can be called that, seemed to be that he wanted to make sure his products weren't harmful to consumers. While this shows a strange form of corporate responsibility, It also demonstrates an almost unbelievable lack of understanding about law enforcement's role in society. The police, naturally, were somewhat surprised to receive packages of illegal drugs in the mail, complete with return address and contact information. It was as if AFFOLTER had created his own arrest warrant and hand-delivered it to law enforcement. What makes this case particularly fascinating is the psychological disconnect it reveals. AFFOLTER seemed to be operating simultaneously in two different realities, one where he was a responsible businessman concerned about product safety, and another where he was manufacturing illegal drugs. The collision of these two mindsets resulted in one of the most self-defeating criminal acts ever recorded. Perhaps most remarkably, AFFOLTER appeared genuinely surprised when the police showed up at his door. This suggests a level of cognitive dissonance that's almost impressive in its completeness. He had somehow convinced himself that the illegal nature of his business was less important than its quality control procedures. Zachary Tentoni. In what might be the most thorough self-identification case in criminal history, Zachary Tentoni managed to turn a simple robbery into a masterclass in unintentional confession. His case perfectly illustrates how panic can lead to not just one, but a series of increasingly helpful mistakes for law enforcement. During a street robbery in Massachusetts, Tentoni dropped something while fleeing the scene. However, this wasn't just any ordinary item, it was a folder containing his birth certificate, social security card, and several other forms of identification. It was as if he had prepared a complete dossier for the police ahead of time. The most remarkable aspect of this case was the thoroughness of the documentation he left behind. Not content with leaving just one form of ID, he provided authorities with multiple ways to confirm his identity. The folder contained enough personal information to not only identify him, but also write his complete biography. What makes this case particularly intriguing from a psychological perspective is how it demonstrates the impact of stress on basic motor functions and awareness. In his hurry to escape, Tentoni not only dropped his documents but apparently didn't even realize what he had lost until it was too late. The case became even more interesting when police discovered that the folder also contained several recent utility bills with his current address. It was as if he had inadvertently created a self-addressed invitation for law enforcement to come arrest him. This incident serves as a perfect example of how the pressure of committing a crime can lead to a cascade of errors, each more helpful to law enforcement than the last. It's almost as if his subconscious mind was working against his criminal intentions. Christopher Wallace. In the age of social media, Christopher Wallace managed to set a new standard for self-incriminating behavior by turning his hide and seek with law enforcement into a live-streamed event. His case perfectly exemplifies how the desire for online attention can override even the most basic survival instincts. While actively hiding from police, Wallace made the extraordinarily poor decision to announce his location on Snapchat. But he didn't just post once, he provided regular updates about his hiding spot, almost like a bizarre reality show. His first post announced that he was hiding in a cabinet to evade the police. When police arrived at the location and began searching, Wallace doubled down on his social media presence. In an almost unbelievable display of poor judgment, he posted another Snapchat message saying they were looking for him in the wrong cabinet. It was as if he was providing play-by-play commentary of his own arrest. What makes this case particularly fascinating is the psychology behind it. Despite being in a situation where silence and discretion were crucial for survival, Wallace couldn't resist the urge to share his experience with his social media followers. This demonstrates how deeply ingrained the need for social media validation has become in modern society. The most remarkable aspect was his apparent belief in invisibility while using technology. This shows a fundamental misunderstanding of both technology and police capabilities, combined with an almost childlike sense of invisibility. This case serves as a perfect example of how the digital age has created new ways for criminals to sabotage themselves. The desire for online attention has become so powerful that it can override even the most basic instinct for self-preservation.